Conversations and Connections series. This is our July 21 program, One Artist, Two Objects, Many Approaches. And so it is my pleasure to welcome both our guests today, María Magdalena Campos-Pons, and also my colleague, Vivian Ladd. My name is Amelia Kahl, and so I'm gonna start with some official introductions. So María Magdalena Campos-Pons is the Cornelius Vanderbilt Endowed Chair of Fine Arts at Vanderbilt University. As an artist, she works across media, combining diverse artistic practices, including photography, painting, sculpture, film, video, performance, and installation work. Her work centers around identity formation, addressing issues of history, memory, gender, and religion. Magda's work is deeply autobiographical. She was born in Cuba and has diverse ancestry, including Chinese ancestors and Yoruba, who were brought to the island and enslaved in the 19th century. These histories of enslavement and the traditions of her ancestors deeply inform her work, as does geography, topography, and the importance of sight. The sea is also a frequent theme, serving as a place of memory and identity formation. She uses it to address issues such as the Middle Passage and the contemporary migrant crisis, as we'll see in work moving forward. In 1991, Magda immigrated to Boston and taught at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University. And in 2017, she was awarded the Vanderbilt Chair at Vanderbilt University and moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where she currently resides. Magda has exhibited widely, including solo exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and the National Gallery of Canada, among others. Her works are held in more than 30 museum collections, including the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and it is our honor, of course, to have her work in the collection here at the Hood Museum of Art. Vivian Ladd, my colleague, is a teaching specialist at the Hood Museum of Art. Vivian has been an art museum educator for 30 years, designing and teaching programs as a museum education consultant. She has worked at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Currier Museum of Art, and the Hood. Her work involves supporting the docent program, developing teaching strategies for the galleries, and organizing teacher and adult workshops. She also coordinates programming with the Geisel School of Medicine and collaborates on programming for the Tuck Business School. She frequently creates museum publications and presents at conferences. So thank you, Magda and Vivian, for joining me this afternoon. My name's Amelia Kahl. I'm the Barbara C. and Harvey P. Hood 1918 Curator of Academic Programming. I work closely with Dartmouth students and faculty, and I worked with them to integrate the museum's collection into the college's curriculum, both in the galleries and in the Bernstein Center for Object Study. I'm also a Dartmouth alumna. I graduated in 2001, and I've been back at the Hood Museum since 2010. So we are incredibly fortunate to have two works by Magda in the Hood Museum of Art's permanent collection. They have been used frequently for teaching across all audiences and connect to a web of related themes. They prompt such a wide range of substantive conversations that they inspired today's program. This afternoon, Magda is going to introduce these works that come from the same series, When I Am Not Here, Estoy Allah. Vivian and I will speak briefly about how we've used these works in our teaching, and then Magda will respond. Toward the end of time, we would love to take some questions from the audience, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. So Magda, I'm going to turn it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about these works and about this series?
Well, good morning. First of all, let me say thank you to both of you and to the Hood Museum for inviting me to this series of conversations about the artists and the process and ideas behind the work. So I am very pleased to have the opportunity to speak with both of you and the member of our audience. So thank you everybody for showing up for another soon in our time of soon conversations. And well, both of these pieces are part of a series that I started actually in 1994. And I noticed something as I read that Untitled from the serie Bueno Here Estoy Allá, the blue piece, I think that is also 95, no 96, but we will check that later. But both of them are referring to kind of locating the experience of the body in the context of new location, in the context of new geography, but also not only reflecting in what is news, but what I'm coming from. So I will say that the piece that is I would call it the blue piece, was very engaged with a conversation about motherhood and the idea of motherland and the idea of mother ocean. I was thinking more in the idea of the ocean as a place of nurturing and as a place in which from where nutrition and new energy could come. So this, in some way, to some extent, I think about this piece now, and I could see a little bit of humor in it, that I was feeling myself almost like this delivering of milk all the time, both way, from my body, and then a storage, and it was always there, like this continuous source of nutrition, but also the ocean itself as the continuous source of nutrition, and the symbolic presence of the small boat, which was carved by me for the making of this photograph from balsa wood, totally filled of nourishment, filled with milk, and this body becoming itself a geography and a topography from where the nutrition comes. For the people that are familiar with Cuban's tradition, and I don't know if many in the audience, but the tradition of Yoruba present within the Cuban belief system, Yemaya, the goddess of the ocean, which is seen as a symbol representation of not only a nurturing, but a savior as well of all the blood body that crossed during the transatlantic journey. So in some way, I am trying to make here too a sort of circularity of the individuality of the body of one single woman becoming a mother, in this case, the symbolic body of an artist itself, and with her tools, I am come back to carving, painting, photograph, performing, all in once, to create this small shireen of worship to the endless, ever-present energy of protection and caring for life that is centralized in the body of a young mother, of any, from any point of origin. So the way that I try to, in some way, eliminate the particularity or signifying one body per se, I do it through eliminating any reference to a skin tone connected with anybody. This is no black, this is no white, this is no yellow, this is no red. This is this other entity, painterly material that is hosting and holding all this potentiality. In the piece in the left from me, in the screen, identity could be a tragedy. Is when I am not here, estoy allá, which means when I am not here, I am there. But I wanted to make it in both Spanish and English to make sure that this dichotomy of the location and the division and the splitting of place of the individual was registered in the title. So when I am not here, estoy allá. When I am not here, cuando no estoy aquí, I am there. No, so we change that. And I wrote in the body, identity could be a tragedy. I want to explain to the audience that this particular piece is a story of a piece that in its totality is a triptych. And in the first image of the triptych, the body will say, it's 6 of them. And what has happened in this one in particular, the body start disappearing. And for me, I think that this one is in the collection of Worcester Museum, correct? And with this, what this indicated, and now this the day here is right 95. I knew there was, and then I put it because the other one is the blue is 94. Make that a note that the blue is 94.
So, we'll fix it, I promise.
but the important thing here is that what I wanted to signify with this piece and what I wanted to really emphasize was not only seeing about trying to define the complexity of identity and the entrapment of identity, but also in some way it was almost I tried to reposition myself in that moment in my time. I was thinking the discussion of identity could be also so absolutely suffocating, and it could be at some point so perversive that could become a erasure of who oneself is. So how do we hold into identity without becoming a toxicity of the understanding of the fighting for a stretch, you know, and establish this is who am I, because only we are in relation to else. So identity is not necessarily obfuscation in our particularity. It's also open the wind to embrace the difference, because we only see what we are in relation to this other thing that we are not. So the melatonin in my skin, so rich and so profound, is visible because you pales ladies, melatonin is in another dimension, no? In the scale of value from 0 to 10, one white skin is 0, a dark skin to the dark tone is 10. That is the beauty of identity. That could be really self-understanding, no opposition to the other. So for me to inscribe in my body, identity could be a tragedy, was a call about, let's make identity in a celebration of the multiplicity and plurality of who we are, not in an opposition force against, you know, who else is different. And this was 95, but I could say it's so vivid in 2021. It's so, we are in such in the middle of really creating more perversive and more toxic a conversation in the entrapment of identity and nationhood and tribal, in a way, perception of our humanity, which is extremely dangerous and scary in some extent. So for me here, it's something, it was a really an important investigation, and also an investigation of photography to exposing this construction of the image and disappearing the piece to this almost light on light, white on white of erasure of over erasure. I don't know if this is good introduction of enough, but
No, it is.
That's perfect, actually. So I'm going to talk about the first work, Untitled. We sort of refer to it as Identity Could Be a Tragedy. In my work at the Hood Museum as a museum educator, I work primarily with public audiences. Pre-pandemic, my work was limited to the objects hanging on the walls of the galleries. Next slide, please. This work, Untitled, was last on view in 2019 as part of a student-curated exhibition exploring issues of migration and Latinx identities. During the pandemic, however, I pivoted to teaching on Zoom, and all of a sudden I had access to all 65,000 objects in the museum's collection. This object appeared more often than any other in the dozens of virtual field trips, private and public programs that I facilitated. Next slide, please. At the Hood Museum of Art, we teach a method of engagement called learning to look. It's a step-by-step process for looking carefully and thinking critically about any work of art. Untitled works beautifully for modeling this method. As you can see, its spare format provides a finite set of artistic choices for the artist to consider. The work features a bust-length portrait, a female figure nude from the shoulders up, facing the viewer with her eyes closed. Her skin is smeared with some kind of substance, and the phrase "identity could be a tragedy" has been inscribed through the substance, revealing the skin tone beneath. The background is white, and the media is the large-scale 20 by 24 Polaroid print with these telltale bleeds on the edges. Once we've described the object to one another and named these choices, we begin to brainstorm about these elements, kind of noting associations, creating theories about what the artist might be asking us to think about, and testing them based on the visual evidence the work provides. Audiences often wonder who this figure might be. Is she standing? Is she lying down? Oftentimes people wonder, is she in a morgue? They also wonder, viewers often question, what is this substance spread on her skin? Did she apply it to herself? Is it some sort of cosmetic to lighten the skin? Or was it smeared on her body by someone else? Is it mud? Are we looking at documentation of an act of violence? The Learn to Look method really encourages diverse interpretations and points of view. And the reality is that both of these theories can coexist and are equally devastating. The nudity, we note, emphasizes her vulnerability. Viewers wonder, are her eyes closed to protect herself? The phrase identity could be a tragedy is powerful and evocative, and it makes people, particularly in 2021, think about race and identity, about recent events like the murder of George Floyd. Again, audiences wonder, how did the words end up on her skin? Were they applied to her? Again, this idea of post-mortem in the morgue comes up often because of the neutrality of the background. Really observant viewers notice that the Y is backwards. And this makes people wonder if perhaps the figure wrote the words in her own skin using a mirror and perhaps flipped the Y. In our method, we take this time to kind of connect with the work of art personally on our own before introducing any background or contextual information. But at a certain point, that becomes quite helpful. So at this point, we might introduce some information about Magda, about her work, her ethnicity, the medium itself. What's really important to point out is that this photograph pictures the artist herself, and that the whole thing was constructed and controlled by the artist. The taking of this photograph was completely under the control of the artist. We also often at this moment like to share visual sources that might have inspired the artist in her work. So next slide. We might introduce some kind of institutional photographs like passport photos, mugshots, driver's licenses. All of these kinds of photographs use this exact same kind of composition, the figure from the shoulders up facing front against a white background. Another type of visual source might be the kind of photography that anthropologists and ethnographers have employed, the same type of frontal photography. But in this case, this type of photography often appears in colonial contexts to create false hierarchies of race. The sitter often has no choice in or agency in determining their dress, their pose, their expression, or ultimately the distribution and consumption of the image. With all of this background information and our careful looking and theorizing to draw from, we then move to the final stage, which is forming interpretations. Next slide. Considering what Magda might have wanted us to think about in the context of this work. And I think what makes this work so powerful and such an important teaching tool is that the way it generates a whole range of really thoughtful and nuanced interpretations. I mean, certainly viewers consider how this image asks us to think about how race is constructed, about the ways in which expectations and assumptions are placed on Black bodies from the outside, and the extent to which those outside forces begin to inform what happens on the inside. Some of those visual sources about institutional photography and anthropological photography brings us to thinking about this choice of the figure closing her eyes against the gaze of the viewer. And people talk about how this is not only an act of self-protection, but also a form of resistance to the viewer's gaze. As we begin to kind of explore different interpretation, empathy grows as viewers and participants consider the extent to which identity can inform safety in society. That morgue association kind of always hums a little bit in the background. And, people talk about and think about how Black and Brown people encounter violence in our culture, both psychic and physical in the world. And then one other final note, just a small detail, but sometimes viewers are drawn to the hairstyle here. And because we have just the one discrete image, sometimes people suggest that that hairstyle becomes a kind of a halo, and this figure a kind of a martyr to society's inequities. So as you can see, this work is tremendously powerful on its own, but it becomes even richer in conversation with other works of art. Next slide. In a recent program for high school students exploring how race is constructed in America, we looked at this work, a spit-by print by Fred Wilson entitled Arise. It pictures sort of blobs of black and gray dots or varying shades of gray on a white ground. Emerging from these forms are these voice bubbles with quotes uttered by Black characters from famous works by white authors. So for instance, next slide, one is from Shakespeare's Othello, which says, "Arise, black vengeance from hollow hell." And another is the words of the cook from Moby Dick in a kind of a dialect. Now, spit bite is a printmaking technique where acid diluted with water or spit is dropped onto a copper plate prepared with rosin. The acid bites into the plate to create a depression to hold the ink. And the longer the acid drips on the plate, the deeper the impression, the darker the black ink will appear in the print. So this print in a lot of ways is asking us to think about the ways in which words and works of literature can bite, can hurt, when Black characters written by white writers are caricatured, demeaned, or consistently made the villain. I have the next slide. And then the next slide. When these two works are considered in unison, all kinds of rich conversations emerge, especially about this notion about figure and ground. In Magda's piece, we see a figure set against a white background. In Fred Wilson's piece, we see these kind of blobs and word bubbles appearing against a white piece of paper. And these accumulations lead audiences to consider the role of history, of repeated wrongs over time, committed in a world where white is normative, and the effect that they have in solidifying prejudice and institutional and contributing to institutional racism. So because of the richness of this image, which I hope you've gotten a sense of from my comments here, next slide, you'll see that I've worked with this with all kinds of different audiences, from high school to adults. And embedded in different contexts, the work takes on different resonances. When presented to high school students or first generation students at Dartmouth, it invites us to think about the role of identity among young people whose sense of identity is emerging. It broadens their kind of awareness of what's going on in the world. For emerging physicians and healthcare workers, a work like this asks them to consider the role of power in our culture, about the authority of the gaze, and ask them to interrogate their biases and prejudices and the role that that might have in delivering healthcare. For staff here at Dartmouth, it's an opportunity to practice having critical conversations in advance of working with students. And then finally, in one final public program, which didn't feature this work, but will feature the blue work, as Magda referred to it, adults were invited to consider stories of persistence, which involved works of modern and contemporary artists who were looking at themes of home, memory, and persistence, and what art can teach us from the past can teach us about the present.
Great. Thank you so much, Vivian. So I'm going to talk about the blue work, and I work primarily with Dartmouth classes with students and faculty, and students are often tasked with relating this work of art to their course material. And as with Vivian's approach, we often start by describing this photograph. So in that vein, I want us to look closely at this image, to the use of the body as ocean, the two bottles of milk yoked across the figure's neck that drip milk over the breasts, the hands that support the carved wooden vessel filled with this milk, and students often interpret this vessel as a boat or as some sort of bowl used for offerings. The blue waves of the body paint merge with the blue background, and this focus on the torso rather than the face as in the previous photograph lend an anonymity to the figure, so it becomes a symbol rather than an individual. A symbol of what depends very much on the students I'm working with and the framework that they're bringing to the photograph. And one strategy we often use to kind of warm up students and to get them to start looking and thinking and feeling validated in their opinions is these personal response cards. So we put a bunch of students in a room with many works of art and give them a set of cards. We don't tell them anything about the artwork, and we ask them to put the cards in front of certain pieces so they can put a heart in front of the one they like the most. Here you can see a yellow card with a question mark, which is the work they have the most questions about. And then there are course specific cards as well, cards that relate to the course material. And Magda's work frequently elicits all of these responses. She gets a lot of hearts. I think often for that blue color is really appealing. She gets a ton of questions. They want to know about it. They want to talk about it. And she gets a ton of cards that relate to the course material. So I often tell the students, I'm pretty transparent. I say, put the cards in front of the ones you want to talk about. And it's Magda's work gets a lot of cards. So it's often one of the first things that we talk about when we're discussing images. I also want to draw your attention to the wide range of classes that have used this work. The museum reopened after a multi-year renovation and expansion in 2019. And in just over 2 years, part of which were deeply affected by the pandemic, right, as was everything, 9 different courses have used this material. As Vivian mentioned, we have over 65,000 works of art in the museum's collection, so we have a lot to choose from. And yet this photograph comes up as relevant time and time again. Since 2012, over 30 classes have used this work. And there is also this wide range of departments, from places you might expect, like Latin American and Caribbean studies, to departments you might not initially think of, such as government and comparative literature. So what is it about this photograph that makes it relevant to so many classes? Here we see students studying the work when it was included in the 2013 exhibition, Shadow Play, Transgressive Photography from the Hood Museum of Art. They're in a class about family memoir, and they discussed how this work relates to the concept of family in one's present and extending back into one's past. Symbols of motherhood, specifically the breast dripping with milk, anchored that conversation, and students then made sense of other details surrounding it. And this is often how those discussions play out. Students will begin with one relevant detail and then branch out. And what detail they start with often depends on what class they're in. So for example, classes such as the evolution of pregnancy, or a class called Made in America, MAID, Made in America. First, emphasis on the female body and on feeding children, whether through breast or bottle feeding. And they bring up issues of maternity and labor. Especially potent is recognition of the labor done by Black women and other women of color, both enslaved and not, in caring for other women's, often white women's, children. One question that often opens up discussion is the race of the figure obscured by the blue paint, and if that changes the student's interpretation. And Magda talked about earlier how you don't know the race of the figure initially. So I pose that to the students. Does it matter what the race of the figure is, or does it matter what the identities of the photographer is? And we know that it's one and the same in this photograph, but the students often don't know that initially. And that really sort of changes and opens up their interpretations and challenges some of their initial interpretations. Students often land on the point that identity does affect interpretation. And it makes a difference what class they're coming from. Are they coming from a class focused on the experience of Black Americans, for example, Black consciousness, Black feminisms? Or are they coming from a class that's at a different angle, for example, Coming to America, which is looking at immigration more broadly? In those classes, the immigration-focused classes, students often begin with the boat and crossing the ocean, coming up with multiple contexts for those journeys and linking that with multiple identities. Students that are thinking about geography or environmental studies tend to focus less on the boat and more on the central figure, reading her as a life-giving force, an aquatic version of Mother Earth, perhaps. And still other classes have used this work to think about religion, including the diasporic nature of African religions and the role that women play in religions. The details in this work are so potent, both specific yet applicable to multiple narratives, and that's what makes this photograph such a rich site of exploration and such a strong catalyst for discussion. In fact, it was used most recently in one of our student-curated online exhibitions as part of our Space for Dialogue exhibition series. Aiden Chisholm, who's a Dartmouth 20, a Dartmouth 21, so she just graduated, looked at the body as, in her words, quote, an inherently political, socially charged site. She put Magda's work in the context of 4 other female artists, all of whom are using the body as medium and as site, and who are all saying something about the complexities of identity. So Magda, after listening to Vivian and I go on about your work and how we've used your work, how do you respond? Was this part of your original intention? Have we diverged from that? I don't think artists often get the chance to hear how museum professionals take their work and use it very widely. So we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating for me as a, you are placing me now in a position that I don't put myself often, which is viewing the experience of viewer in my work. So be a voyeur of all that happened around the world. And I am really, not only that it's an extraordinary opportunity to see how do you guys contextualize and how do you guys interpret the work, but also how the work is used in the academic setting. I think that this is, I was thinking before, it's not often that I have been invited to do an analysis and critical approximation of the work from the perspective of how the institution itself put it in the context of educational project and programs with the university. So this is very valuable for me, and this is I learning. There are a few things that I am learning. I mean, there are many things that coincide with my intention. Like, for instance, when you mention labor, you know, I am thinking, remember, maternity and giving birth to a child is called a labor. They don't no, so women, we are workers. This idea that women work almost in every aspect of their life to some extent is very much engaged in societal kind of frame of ideas and nomenclature in some way. So yes, we're going to labor, we're going to have a baby, and then we labor through all the time, you know, this doesn't stop. So this just a position of the labor of giving birth, the labor of the biology, but also the history of the Black body in the context of using as labor, you know, especially in the idea in the period of the slave trade and in the period of all these other inequalities. Stay in my mind, and I am trying to eliminate the identity in this case of the figure, because I want it to be much more abstract in the possibility of how many, what is the expansive option of how to read the implication of this image. So this is important, and I am surprised but happily to see that these many other classes such as government, I am thinking statistics, you know, it could be, there are so many areas that you guys are opening of interpretation. And for me as a maker, and also as an academic, as a professor, I help my students to interpret the work of other artists when we are in a studio class. This is really important too, because, but I don't have these conversations about the comparative approximation about how the museum taught my work and read my work versus how in my own practice as a professor, I go to interpreting history of art in general. I am also charmed and challenged when you tell me that you get the students a selection of all art and say, put a card, you know, as a maker, I don't make a piece of art thinking how it's going to compare in the museum. but I am happy and it's a little bit of good satisfaction and inspiration to move forward, that the image capture the attention of the students and questions come from it. So this for any maker, for any artist, this is very important and invigorating to know that is not an image that people pass by. You know, when I am teaching, I tell to my students the challenge that visual artists have in the period that I become an artist is that we're living in a time in which media and the digital realm and mediatic experience is so intense and is so profound that to create image that hold attention is a very complex, no? And we tend to pass very fast by the image that we see because it's so much. So for a visual artist, this is a real challenge. What kind of image could still hold the attention in this traditional form? No, there is no a digital file that still hold attention for people, and that really could convey meaning, and it convey an opportunity to expand interpretation. Because as I say, for me, and I am speaking now not only as a maker but as a professor, the art start when it open a new question. You know, it start to be of value when you are in front and you say, what is this, and what is about? And you know, even if I dislike it because I don't understand it, but it let me go with a question about what is there that I don't like. So this is important. So this is I am saying that, you know, I myself, I don't revisit my work often out of being busy and moving to, and it's interesting. This is very good for me. As I was seeing these pieces, I'm thinking, I want to revisit Identity Could Be a Tragedy now, which is exactly 30 years later, no? and see what it means. What is this idea of you know, I you know, what is this body telling? What is this face? What is this expression could tell the same question, or what question this problem plays, and how could be this problem answer visually now? No, when this image already is existing there, what is the image response for that same problem at this particular moment? And I am thinking of that as you guys are talking, because your conversation made me think about that. It's something about, first of all, in some way, frustrated me, the immediacy and the permanency of the non-resolved problems that made me make that piece the time that I did it years ago. This is still a place of contention and frustration in some way as an individual, but also what else? What is, and also what is the response for this question now? Is a photograph, portraiture, is a mood? I don't know. I am making a new piece in my mind now, you know, prompted by these conversations that you guys are proposing.
Well, if it comes to fruition, those new pieces, you must let us know, because we would love to see the 30 years later.
Absolutely.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience, and we have some time to take them. The first one is, water is a critical element in your work. Is there a relationship between the ocean and the desert? These two expansive natural spaces, both vectors of migration, one so wet, one so dry, seems to be compelling the movement of masses of people to overcome boundaries.
Oh my God, how a beautiful question, how valuable, how rich, how amazing. Whoever that placed the question, I want, since you are an artist, if you are a maker, take that question and find a response to your making. Because I think that would be fantastic. And also, this question prompted me to think that in the piece of Identity Could Be a Tragedy, even when it's wet, and even what is implying viscosity and wetness in the surface, that there is an added capacity to it. That is a reference to dryness. And how that is there done? Because the inclusion in the body is scarred to the materiality of whatever that is in the skin. And it's something very interesting. Black skin, I did a piece later, few years later, that was called, if I could remember the name now, I could not remember the name now because the piece is not in front of me and I forgot the title of some of my pieces. But I will remember, most likely when we finish this lecture, you know, this has happened when 30 years passed. But I wrote in my skin. I wrote directly in my skin. And that it implies something about the particularity of body itself. And also I wanted to mention particularity of geography as well. So and the body as a topography, where these ideas of identity, belonging, which is behind and underneath, being part of something is being accepted into something as well. So you become, you know, in the clique of whatever it is, but when the clique is bad, concept in my way. But I am thinking that I see wet and arid. I see in these two pieces, you reference to ocean and desert. You reference to water and sand, maybe by the chroma of the pieces, which one is sepia tone and ochre, and the other one is all this blue, ultramarine, all of that. But I'm thinking that it would be amazing. It's a very good question. And yes, it's very important. It's very important. I don't know if I answered.
Thank you. That was great. So we also have a question from Lisa Valdez, who is a professor in the government department who has come to the museum and used your work with her classes. And she asks, she says, artists are today and have been for a long time at the forefront of the dissident movement in Cuba. Can you tell us about the status of artists in revolutionary Cuba and why they are playing the leading role in the opposition?
Well, thank you, Alice, for using my work in your class, and thank you for being here and making the question. My response with that would be succinct and brief. Artists are witness of their time. And when they are true observers and true tellers of their time, they will capture what is need, and they capture, and sometimes they imagine what solution could come as well. So I don't remember any time in history in which artists have not telling truth. So the artists that are now in Cuba expressing discontent, and the artists that are making art but not expressing discontent necessarily, but record and represent the reality of Cuba, they are all, like in any part of the planet, they are pioneers. They are seeing what the imaginary is not in the artist a place to go, is where they exist. So I am a supporter in a quiet way and in behind door way of everything that is important to really create a space for freedom and a space for everyone to express what they seeing and be true to their time. So I think that from the very beginning, artists are, revolution is making art, and maybe the lasting revolution of human experience is the one that come out of creative mind.
Thank you. And Professor Valdez says thank you too. So we're just about the end of time, but I have one more question and then we'll wrap up, which is, Magda, could you tell us a little bit about your experience about making these works? How did you literally put them together? How did you physically, what were the studio conditions? What are your memories?
I was very young. I was just a baby. And remember, I studied art in Mass College of Art. So I was a student in Mass College of Art in 1988 in the master program. And Mass College of Art is one of the few places in the world that have at that time, and it still has, a 20 by 24 large Polaroid camera. Remember, Land made the camera in MIT, Massachusetts, and Mass College of Art put the hand in one. At that time were 5 cameras in the entire planet. So when I was a student in mass art, I was introduced to the 20 by 24 Polaroid. And I have repeated this many times. And somebody, I have repeated this many times that my class, everybody would come in front of the camera and say, hi, you know, and and I am making too many expressions here on my lamp. Hi, you make big thing and you take the shot. And we, during the class itself, we were introduced to many things regarding media. I was part of a group that was totally involved with what we call in Mass College of Art, the media department. And media was doing performance, film, a video class, photography, Polaroid. this is 1988. I didn't do anything else with the camera, with the Polaroid camera for a number of years. But in 1990, I was doing another series of photograph and traditional photograph. And one series of that photograph was exhibited at the New Museum in New York. And Jeff Kahl, who was the director of the art gallery in Mass College of Art, saw the work at the New Museum in New York, and literally called me and say, I would love for you to come and work with the Polaroid camera. And it was through another medium, and it was, I don't know, love at face eyes. I was doing performative pieces, and Polaroid opened those opportunity. So this particular piece, the blue piece, was shot at Mass College of Art, 1994. And I just have been having my boy, 1993. I was still breastfeeding him. and my idea was, well, I want to do something with photography that is very cohesive and consistent with my practice, which is totally interdisciplinary. I'm a painter, doing performance and doing a sculpture, all of that. And really, the first body of work that I produced there, which this piece belonged to it, was very beautifully received by all kind of audience and people. Polaroid has had for many, many years a tradition to invite what they call avant-garde photographers and people to come and play. And literally, I was one of these artists that Polaroid adopted in the tradition of from Adams to Andy Warhol to everybody. They have a real name in photography. So I was extremely lucky and extremely privileged. And so I would go to the studio with and always one assistant, 2 or 3 people that assist me beside the studio head. In this case, I was working with Tracy in Massachusetts. All my later Polaroid photographs have been produced in New York without exception. And I have been working with John Reuters in the latest. I work with Jennifer Rauch in between. So they are a number of very important people always in the studio with me with their own photography practice themselves. And I always have assistant to painting, and these are simple to me. I have created very complex things. But as Amelia was saying, as Vivian was saying earlier, I wrote the text in my own body. I would paint part of what I could paint. I always painted the entire body. There are pieces that are done in my backside that I ask assistant to paint my body. And it always was conceived, as I use as a definition, a constructed photograph, a performative photograph. I also refuse to be called just photographer because I say, I do a lot of photography that I don't exhibit, but this was so a structure as a set, a craft setting in which one particular image is drawn to the details, to this is exactly what I want in the end. So this nowadays I am making less image because I have moved into this very large multiple panels pieces that required days and days and an effort. So I am going to produce 3 new photographs, possible in 21, 22. And when I produce one good photograph in the year, I am very pleased, very happy in the Polaroid because is and the Polaroid is still making films for a number of people. I have been lucky to be one of those, and it's a fantastic, delicious process in which I found a lot of space to play and to find ways to express and build. I think some good image.
Well, Magda, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, for being so generous with sharing your time and your thoughts and your responses and letting us kind of talk about your work to you. Thank you, Vivian. And this program was Vivian's idea. So thank you, Vivian, for collaborating and working together. And thank you so much for the audience. Thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. You'll see an email with a survey coming up. So we appreciate it if you could take the time to fill that out. And I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon. So thanks, folks.
Thank you all.
Thank you, you both.
Bye-bye, everybody.